I'm a 28-year-old woman who just moved out of my family home for the first time. For some people, that might not sound like a big deal, but for me, it was huge. I come from a super tight-knit family. We're the kind where everyone knows each other's business, and honestly, I used to be okay with that. But after years of feeling like I had to be the responsible one, always looking out for my younger siblings and juggling family expectations, I needed some space. I've got two siblings, a sister who's 25 and a brother who's 22. Being the oldest, I was always the go-to person for advice, help with homework, driving lessons, and basically anything that required being the responsible adult. My parents, both in their mid-50s, have always been involved in our lives. And by involved, I mean constantly checking in on us, knowing our schedules, and showing up to help whenever they felt like it. Don't get me wrong, I love my family. But as I got older, I started to feel suffocated. There was never any privacy. Even in my late 20s, I couldn't make a decision without hearing their opinions. So I decided it was time to get my own place, a tiny apartment on the other side of town. It's nothing fancy, but it's mine, and I finally felt like I had some breathing room. Before I moved, I had to sit down with my parents and siblings. I tried to explain that I'd need some time to adjust to living alone. I wanted to set boundaries, like asking them to call before visiting and setting specific days for family time. My parents nodded along, and my siblings seemed to get it, but deep down, I had a feeling they didn't really understand what I was asking for. A few days after moving in, I had my first taste of what living alone could be like. Peaceful, no interruptions, just me and my own space. It was amazing while it lasted. Then, on the fourth day, I heard a knock on my door. It was my mom, standing there with 2 bags of groceries. She didn't call, didn't text, just showed up. She said she was worried I wasn't eating well and thought she'd bring me some food. I didn't want to be ungrateful, so I thanked her, but I reminded her about our agreement to call before coming over. She brushed it off, saying she was just being a mom and couldn't help worrying about her baby girl living on her own. I let it slide, hoping it wouldn't happen again. Spoiler, it did. The following weekend, my sister turned up with an overnight bag. She claimed she just wanted to crash for the weekend. I figured, okay, maybe she just missed me and wanted to hang out. So I let her stay, hoping it would be a one-time thing. But then it started to become a pattern. Unannounced visits, little drop-ins, and constant messages in the family group chat. And that group chat, wow. If I didn't reply within a couple of hours, I'd get follow-up texts asking if I was okay, why I wasn't answering, or if I was too busy for the family now. It felt like I couldn't even have a moment to myself without someone expecting me to be available. The final straw came when my dad decided to stop by my workplace one afternoon. I was in the middle of my shift when I saw him in the lobby, waving. He thought it would be nice to have lunch together. My coworkers were giving me confused looks, and I had to awkwardly explain that yes, that was my dad, and no, he didn't tell me he was coming. I quickly told him that I was busy and couldn't chat, and he left looking a bit hurt, but I felt more embarrassed than anything. After that incident, I realized I needed to have a serious talk with my parents. So I invited them over for dinner, thinking a calm, sit-down conversation might do the trick. I explained how I felt about the unannounced visits and the constant texts. I told them it wasn't that I didn't want to see them, it's just that I needed some time to adjust to my new life and that I valued my privacy. But instead of taking it seriously, they just laughed. My mom waved it off, saying I was being dramatic, and my dad joked that they were just showing me how much they cared. They kept saying things like, "You'll understand when you have kids," which just made me feel like they weren't listening at all. After that, my brother started asking me to run errands for him since I lived closer to certain shops. When I said no, because I had other plans, he got all mopey, saying he thought I'd be more helpful now that I was out on my own. And it was like no one understood that I had my own life and responsibilities to manage. Then came the guilt trips. My mom would drop little comments like, "I miss the old days when we all had dinner together every night," or "It's just not the same without you." I knew she didn't mean to make me feel bad, but it was working. I'd start to question if I was being too harsh, if maybe I was asking for too much. So I talked to a few close friends about it, and they all had the same advice. You need to be firm with your boundaries. They reminded me that just because I loved my family didn't mean I had to give up my space or let them dictate my life. It was nice to hear that I wasn't being unreasonable, even though my family made me feel like I was. Taking their advice to heart, I typed out a message for the family group chat, laying out clear rules for visits and communication. I told them I loved them but needed time to adjust, and that I'd appreciate if they respected my space. I even set up a few regular dinner dates so we could still catch up. For about a week, things seemed to get better. The visits slowed down, the texts became less frequent, and I actually had time to settle into my new routine. But then, everything blew up when I couldn't make it to a last-minute family dinner. Suddenly, I was getting calls and texts accusing me of not caring about the family anymore. It was like all the progress we'd made disappeared overnight. And that's when I realized this wasn't going to be as simple as just asking for space. Update 1. Pal. So, things escalated quickly after that last blow-up about the family dinner. My parents and I had a tense back and forth, but I kept standing my ground. I thought they might start to understand that I needed my own space. But then, one Saturday morning, they showed up at my apartment again, completely unannounced. I hadn't even had breakfast yet when I heard a knock, and there they were, smiling on my doorstep, saying they were in the neighborhood. They had a bag of groceries with them, like it was supposed to smooth things over. I took a deep breath and reminded them of our agreement about calling before visiting. My dad just shrugged and said they thought I wouldn't mind. My mom chimed in about how she missed me, and they figured it would be a nice surprise. But I wasn't backing down this time. I told them it wasn't a good time for a visit, and that I needed them to respect the boundaries I had set. They didn't take it well. My mom's face fell, and my dad started to look annoyed. They stood there for a few awkward seconds, waiting for me to change my mind. When they realized I wasn't budging, they left, looking hurt and upset. As they walked away, I could hear my mom muttering about how they never thought their own daughter would shut them out like this. After they left, I sat on my couch, wondering if I had been too harsh. But deep down, I knew I had to stick to my boundaries if I wanted things to change. The silence from my parents in the following days was deafening. They stopped messaging me in the family group chat, and when I tried to reach out with a simple "Hi, hope you're well," my messages went unanswered. They were giving me the cold shoulder, and I started to wonder if I had made things worse. Just as I was starting to think that maybe I'd gone too far, my sister began messaging me. A lot. At first, it was just casual stuff, how her week was going, asking if I'd watched a certain TV show. But then, the guilt tripping started. She told me that mom and dad were heartbroken after the way I treated them. She said I should think about their feelings and accused me of being selfish. The texts kept coming, multiple times a day, like she was trying to wear me down. Then came the emergency call. One evening, my phone rang, and it was my mom, sounding panicked. She was talking fast, saying there was some issue with the dishwasher at home, and that she didn't know what to do. Without thinking, I grabbed my keys and rushed over. But when I got there, it turned out to be something ridiculously minor, a loose pipe that didn't even require any tools. My dad was already fixing it by the time I arrived. I realized then that the whole thing had been exaggerated just to get me over there. That was the last straw. I pulled my sister aside the next day and asked her to stop with the manipulation. I told her I knew what she was doing, and it wasn't fair. She shot back, saying I thought I was too good for the family now that I had my own place. It turned into a full-blown argument right there in my parents' living room. My sister stormed off, and I left feeling more frustrated than ever. I took to Reddit that night. I needed advice, real, unbiased advice. I laid out everything that had happened and asked if I was in the wrong for insisting on my boundaries. The responses were overwhelmingly supportive. People told me I wasn't asking for too much and that it might be time to consider more drastic measures if my family couldn't respect my space. A lot of commenters suggested that I might need to enforce consequences, even if that meant temporarily distancing myself from them. After reading through all the comments, I realized I needed help figuring out my next steps. So I booked an appointment with a therapist. During our session, I talked through everything: my parents' refusal to respect my boundaries, my guilt, and my fear of losing them completely. The therapist helped me see that I wasn't doing anything wrong by wanting to have my own life and that I needed to stand firm, even if it felt uncomfortable. With that new perspective, I decided to try a different approach. I reached out to my parents and suggested a compromise. I'd come over for family dinners twice a month, but they needed to respect my privacy outside of those visits. My dad agreed, saying it sounded reasonable. My mom, on the other hand, was clearly not thrilled. She kept talking about how she felt like I was slipping away from the family, but eventually she agreed too. For a little while, things seemed to settle down. My dad stuck to the plan, and the family dinners were actually pretty nice, calm, no drama, just catching up over a meal. But it wasn't long before my mom started dropping hints that she wanted me to visit more often, like mentioning how much she'd cooked or how they'd saved me a plate. I could see where things were heading, so I tried to ignore it. Then my brother called out of nowhere, asking if I could help him move some furniture since I was so close by. I told him I couldn't because I had a prior commitment that day. He got frustrated, saying he thought I'd be more available now that I lived alone. That conversation left a bad taste in my mouth, but I knew I couldn't keep letting them drag me back into old habits. By then, I felt more determined than ever to stick to my boundaries, no matter how many guilt trips or awkward conversations came my way. I reminded myself why I moved out in the first place: to have my own life, free from constant expectations. But just when I thought I had things under control, I came home one evening to find my mom sitting on the steps outside my apartment building. She told me she just wanted to see me and that she missed our chats. I was exhausted from work and wasn't in the mood for another confrontation, but I held my ground. I reminded her gently about our agreement and said she should have called first. She looked hurt, but this time she didn't argue. She just left quietly, and I went inside, wondering if this was ever going to get easier. It's like every time I think I've made progress, something pulls me back in. I'm holding the line for now, but who knows what's coming next. Update 2. After that awkward encounter with my mom outside my apartment, I figured things couldn't get much worse. But of course I was wrong. A few days later, my mom showed up again, this time looking more emotional than before. She knocked on my door, saying she just wanted to come inside and talk. I was firm. I reminded her of our agreement and told her I wasn't going to open the door if she kept coming over without notice. She started to cry right there in the hallway, talking through the door about how much she missed me and didn't understand why I was acting this way. It was hard listening to her, but I didn't back down. Eventually she left, wiping her eyes, and I went back inside, feeling drained but knowing I couldn't let her in, or it would never stop. The next morning, my phone started buzzing with messages from my sister and brother. They were furious, saying that I had made our mom cry and asking how I could be so cold-hearted. My sister sent paragraphs about how our mom had always done everything for us, and now she was devastated because of me. My brother wasn't much better. He hinted that I'd changed since moving out, becoming selfish and uncaring. It felt like they had teamed up to make me feel guilty. With my phone lighting up every few minutes, I decided to bring this up with my therapist. During our session, I told her about what happened with my mom and how my siblings were reacting. She listened carefully, then suggested I continue to reinforce my boundaries but find small ways to reassure my family that I still cared about them. Her advice was to try and separate the idea of boundaries from rejection in their minds, even though I couldn't control how they perceived it. It sounded like a good plan, but I wasn't sure how to pull it off. Then, my sister took the drama online. I logged onto Facebook and saw she'd posted a vague status about people who forget where they come from and how family should always come first. She didn't mention my name, but I knew it was aimed at me. Within hours, I started getting messages from cousins and aunts, asking what was going on and why I was being so distant. It was mortifying, I didn't respond to any of them, I just hoped it would blow over, but I knew my family wouldn't let it drop that easily. I decided I needed to try one last time to clear the air, so I suggested a family meeting. My idea was to sit down with my parents and siblings and explain my side again, hoping this time they'd really listen. I even wrote out a list of reasons why having space was important to me. Things like needing time to adjust to living alone, managing stress from work, and how I wasn't trying to push them away. When the day of the meeting came, it went south almost immediately. My mom broke down crying within minutes, saying she felt like I didn't want to be part of the family anymore. My dad, instead of calming her down, sided with her, talking about how they'd always put family first, and that my boundaries felt like a personal rejection. It was like they were ganging up on me, not really hearing a word I was saying. I tried to explain that I wasn't trying to abandon them, but every time I spoke, my mom interrupted, asking if I even cared about them anymore. It was clear I wasn't getting through. My dad was no better, he kept bringing up all the things they'd done for me over the years. Like that should mean I owed them constant access to my life. I had to keep my voice steady as I told them that I couldn't keep sacrificing my mental health to meet their expectations. I stood firm, saying I wasn't backing down from the boundaries I'd set. My mom just looked crushed, and my dad got quiet, shaking his head like he couldn't believe what I was saying. The atmosphere in the room felt heavy, like we'd just crossed a line we couldn't uncross. After that meeting, I could feel the distance growing between us even more. My parents barely spoke to me, and when they did, it was tense and formal. It felt like I was on the edge of losing them altogether, but I didn't know what else I could do. Then I found out my brother had been talking to my parents behind my back about my social life. Apparently, he'd been sharing details about my nights out with friends and how I had time to hang out with them, but not with family. I only found out when a cousin mentioned it at a gathering, and it made my stomach drop. I felt betrayed, like my own brother was using my life as ammunition against me. After that, I tried to reconnect with my brother, hoping we could clear the air one-on-one. But when we met up, he was defensive right from the start, saying I'd changed since moving out. He accused me of acting like I was better than them, just because I had my own place now. It turned into another argument, with both of us leaving feeling even more distant. I posted an update on Reddit again, telling everyone what had gone down and how I felt like I was losing my family. The support was overwhelming. So many people told me I was doing the right thing, but I couldn't keep letting them push my boundaries. It gave me the encouragement I needed to keep going, even though part of me was scared I was making a mistake. Things got worse when I heard through a cousin that my parents had been talking about me to other relatives, painting me as the difficult one who didn't want to be around the family. It stung, but I realized I couldn't control what they said. I was tired of feeling like I had to justify my choices. I decided to take action. I installed a security camera outside my apartment and sent a message to my parents, letting them know that I wouldn't be answering the door anymore if they showed up without calling first. I made it clear that this was my final attempt to get them to respect my space. For the first time in a while, I felt a bit of relief, like I had taken back some control over my life. I don't know how my parents will react to this new boundary, but at this point, I'm prepared for whatever comes next. I just hope they understand that it's not about shutting them out, it's about protecting my own peace. Update 3. After installing the security camera, I thought things might calm down, but that hope didn't last long. A few days later, the familiar knock came on my door, and I checked the camera feed. There were my parents, standing outside with their usual determined expressions. My mom held a pie, like it was a peace offering, while my dad looked like he was ready for a confrontation. I watched them through the camera, deciding not to answer the door. They knocked again, louder this time, and I could hear my mom calling my name, saying they just wanted to talk. After a few minutes of me not responding, my dad started pacing around, clearly getting frustrated. My mom eventually sat on the steps, looking upset, while my dad tried to peer into my apartment windows. It was uncomfortable, but I stayed quiet and kept an eye on the camera feed until they finally gave up and left. The next morning, I woke up to an email from my dad. It was long, like really long. He wrote about how hurt they were by my behavior, how they never expected their own daughter to treat them this way, and how if I didn't start acting like part of the family again, they would have to cut me off financially. I sat there reading it, stunned. It felt like a threat, even though I'd been financially independent since moving out. They hadn't supported me since I got my first job after college, so the email felt more like a power play than an actual risk to my livelihood. That email hit me harder than I expected. I ended up breaking down in my apartment, feeling like I was losing my family over something that should have been simple, just wanting my own space. I posted another update on Reddit, explaining everything that had happened, from the security camera incident to the email. The support from other users was overwhelming. People told me to hold my ground, even suggesting that I might need to go no contact for my own sanity. Some shared similar stories, making me feel less alone in this mess. After reading the comments, I decided to consult a lawyer. It might have seemed dramatic, but I wanted to make sure my parents couldn't take any legal actions that might affect me, like messing with any family inheritance or trying to cause trouble for me. The lawyer was reassuring, saying that I was in a strong position and that my parents couldn't do much to harm me legally. It was a relief to hear, even if it didn't solve the emotional side of things. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, my mom showed up at my workplace again. This time it was during my lunch break, and she was waiting in the lobby, hoping to talk. My stomach dropped when I saw her through the glass doors, knowing this wouldn't end well. I walked out to meet her, trying to keep things calm, but told her she couldn't just show up at my job like this. She didn't take it well, raising her voice about how I was shutting her out and how much it hurt. People started to notice, glancing over as she got more upset. I kept my voice low, asking her to leave, but it was too late. The scene was already unfolding. Eventually she left, looking hurt. but the damage was done. Later that afternoon, HR called me in for a talk. They were polite but firm, reminding me that personal issues shouldn't spill over into the workplace. I felt humiliated, promising it wouldn't happen again, but it just added to the pressure I was already under. A few days after the work incident, my brother decided to escalate things online. He took screenshots of a few photos I'd posted on social media, me out with friends, smiling at a local bar, and sent them to our family group chat. He made snide comments about how I apparently had time for everyone else but not for our family. It felt like a deliberate attempt to paint me as the bad guy. I took to Reddit again, sharing how my brother was trying to turn my social life into more ammunition against me. The commenters rallied behind me, encouraging me to consider going no contact. They pointed out that if my family couldn't respect my boundaries now, they probably never would. Then came the unannounced visit with reinforcements. My parents showed up at my apartment with my aunt and uncle, who they apparently roped in to mediate. I watched through the security camera as they all gathered outside, my dad knocking and calling out my name while my aunt and uncle tried to play peacemakers. They were talking about how family is everything and asking me to come outside so we could all have a heart-to-heart. I stayed inside, my heart racing, but I knew I couldn't open that door. They stayed out there for almost an hour, going through cycles of knocking, talking, and eventually just waiting on the steps. It felt like an eternity before they finally left, my mom looking teary-eyed as my dad led her back to the car. That night, I blocked their numbers. I needed time to think without constant messages, without the pressure. I explained on Reddit that I just couldn't handle it anymore, and I needed space to figure out my next move. A lot of users understood, saying that sometimes a temporary block was the only way to get a moment of peace. After a week, I unblocked them, and my phone immediately buzzed with a flood of messages. Some were apologies, with my mom saying she just missed me and my dad sounding more restrained, but others were filled with accusations, blaming me for tearing the family apart. It was overwhelming, but I had expected it. I decided to try a different approach and reached out to my siblings, asking if we could meet without our parents involved. I hoped that maybe I could explain myself better, without all the extra tension. But the meeting didn't go well. My sister cried, saying she didn't understand why I was doing this to the family, while my brother called me cold-hearted, claiming I'd changed since moving out. It felt like we were speaking different languages, and I left feeling more isolated than before. That's when I made the hardest decision yet. I told my parents and siblings I was going no contact for a month. I hoped that this break would give them time to realize that I wasn't trying to push them away, I just needed my own life. The first week of silence was eerie. No texts, no surprise visits, just quiet. It felt like a relief, but also like something was missing. I started wondering if maybe this could actually work, if they'd respect my space after all this. Toward the end of the month, a letter showed up in my mailbox. It was from my mom, handwritten and a bit shaky. She wrote that she missed me and didn't understand what she'd done wrong, begging me to come back to the family. It was hard to read, but I still don't know if I'm ready to reach out just yet. Update 4. When I received that letter from my mom, it was hard to ignore. She had handwritten every line, and it was filled with phrases like "we miss you" and "we just want our family back together." But as I read it, I realized that nowhere in those pages did she acknowledge the reason I distanced myself in the first place. She didn't mention the constant intrusions or my need for space. It was all about how hurt they felt and how much they missed me. I felt conflicted. Part of me wanted to believe that this was a step toward reconciliation, but another part of me knew it still wasn't addressing what really mattered. I took to Reddit once more, sharing parts of the letter and asking for advice. The responses came flooding in, with many users pointing out that the letter seemed more about guilt than genuine understanding. They advised me to hold my ground and wait for a real acknowledgement of my boundaries before making any decisions. A few suggested I write back with my own letter, explaining my side again, but I wasn't sure if that would actually get through to them. Then a few days later, I had a chance encounter with my brother at a cafe. It was purely by accident, one of those awkward small-town moments where you end up face-to-face when you're just trying to grab a coffee. He looked just as surprised to see me, but instead of a friendly hello, things got tense right away. He brought up the family drama, accusing me of blowing everything out of proportion and tearing the family apart over something so small. I tried to explain that it wasn't about something small, it was about years of feeling suffocated and wanting some independence, but he didn't get it. We went in circles for a few minutes before I gave up and walked out, feeling the distance between us grow even more. Not long after that, one of my close friends reached out to me with an uncomfortable revelation. My parents had contacted them, asking if they could try to convince me to reconnect with the family. I was mortified that they had involved my friends, but my friend was firm in their support. They told me that they'd made it clear to my parents that they wouldn't pressure me into anything, and that they respected my decision. It was a relief to hear that someone had my back, especially when everything else felt so shaky. In my next therapy session, I talked through all these recent events, and my therapist helped me see something I hadn't quite grasped before. My parents' behavior wasn't just about wanting to stay close, it was about control. They didn't like that I had made decisions that they couldn't influence. This realization hit hard, but it also lifted a weight off my shoulders. It made me feel more certain about the boundaries I'd set. Right when I thought things were settling down, my parents sent me a care package. Inside were all my favorite childhood snacks, along with a note that read, "We just want you to know we're thinking about you." At first, I thought it was a sweet gesture, but the more I thought about it, the more it felt manipulative, like they were trying to lure me back with nostalgia. They still weren't addressing the real issues, and it made me even more frustrated. Then, one evening, my dad showed up unannounced again. He was banging on my door, demanding to talk, his voice rising with every knock. I pulled up the camera feed and saw him standing there, looking angry. I had told them I wouldn't be opening the door for unannounced visits, so I stuck to that promise. But when he refused to leave after several minutes, I finally shouted through the door that I would call the police if he didn't stop. That seemed to get through to him. He hesitated, looking conflicted, before finally storming off. The whole thing left me shaken, but I knew I couldn't let this continue. After that encounter, I started seriously considering a restraining order. I posted about it on Reddit, asking if anyone had been through something similar. The responses were mixed. Some people thought it was a necessary step to protect myself, while others worried it might escalate things even further with my family. It was a tough decision, and I hadn't made up my mind yet. Just when I thought things couldn't get more complicated, my sister called me, her voice trembling as she apologized for how she'd treated me. She said she finally understood why I needed space and admitted that she'd never realized how suffocating our family could be. She asked if there was any way we could meet, just the two of us, without involving our parents. It caught me off guard, but I decided to give it a chance, hoping it could be a small step toward fixing things. We met at a quiet cafe, and to my surprise, the conversation went better than I expected. My sister acknowledged that she had been too caught up in our parents' perspective, and that she never really considered how it all might feel for me. She even admitted that she sometimes felt overwhelmed by our parents' involvement in her own life, but she never thought to push back. For the first time, it felt like someone in my family truly heard me. By the end of our meeting, my sister offered to try talking to our parents, explaining that I wasn't abandoning them, but that I just needed some time and space. I wasn't sure how much difference it would make, but I appreciated that she was willing to try. It felt like a small win, like maybe things could change, even if just a little. A few days later, I received another letter from my mom. This time, the tone was different. She wrote that maybe they had been wrong, that perhaps they overstepped, and that they were willing to try family therapy if I was open to it. It was the first time she had even hinted at taking some responsibility, and I was honestly shocked. But I still couldn't shake the worry that this might just be another way to pull me back into the fold without any real changes. So, now I'm at a crossroads. Part of me wonders if this could be a chance for real progress, but another part worries that things will just go back to the way they were before. I haven't decided yet if I'm ready to give family therapy a shot, but at least for the first time, it feels like there's a small glimmer of hope. I guess we'll see where this goes. Update 5. Aita. After a lot of back and forth in my head, I decided to give family therapy a shot. I made it clear that I would only attend if my therapist could join as a support, and my parents reluctantly agreed. My sister, who had become more understanding lately, encouraged the idea, saying it might be a chance for everyone to hear each other out. So, we booked the session, and I went in hoping for the best but preparing for the worst. The first session was tense, to say the least. My parents walked in looking uncomfortable, like they weren't sure what to expect. My mom kept glancing at me, trying to gauge my mood, while my dad sat with his arms crossed, clearly defensive. My therapist started by letting everyone share their side, and that's when things got complicated. My parents spoke mostly about how hurt they were by the distance, how they missed me, and how they didn't understand why things had to change so drastically. They talked about feeling like they'd lost their daughter and couldn't figure out why I didn't want to be around them anymore. I tried to stay calm, explaining once again that it wasn't about not wanting to see them, but about needing some space and time for myself. My therapist helped steer the conversation back whenever it veered off track, but there were moments when it felt like we were going in circles. It wasn't until my dad admitted that he struggled with feeling left out of my life that things shifted a little. My mom even apologized for some of the unannounced visits, admitting she hadn't realized how much it bothered me. It felt like a small breakthrough, but I stayed cautious, knowing how quickly things could flip. After the session, I thought maybe, just maybe, we were starting to understand each other. But on the drive home, my parents asked me to resume weekly family dinners, saying it would make them feel better about everything. I told them I wasn't ready for that, and reminded them that we needed to take things slowly. My mom got quiet, and my dad sighed heavily, but I stood my ground. The drive ended in awkward silence. My sister tried to step in again, mediating between us. She reminded my parents that pressuring me would only push me further away. It was a relief to have her on my side, but it didn't change the fact that my parents still didn't seem to get it. I decided to agree to one more family therapy session, but I made it clear if they couldn't respect my boundaries afterward, I'd go back to no contact. The second session went better than the first. My parents agreed to a plan where visits would be scheduled in advance, no more unannounced appearances, and we would stick to meeting up in neutral places like parks or restaurants for a while. My mom looked a little hesitant, but my dad nodded along, saying they would try. It felt like a win, but I was careful not to let my guard down too quickly. For the next few weeks, my parents actually followed through. They texted before coming over, even if it was just to drop something off, and they respected when I told them I had other plans. It was strange, but in a good way, to see them trying. I started feeling cautiously optimistic, thinking maybe this could work out after all. I shared an update on Reddit, explaining how things seemed to be improving, but also how I was still keeping my expectations low. A lot of people congratulated me on the progress, but some warned me to stay vigilant. They reminded me that real change takes time, and that it's easy for people to fall back into old habits. I appreciated their support and kept those warnings in mind. My friends, too, were skeptical. They pointed out that my parents might just be on their best behavior because they didn't want to lose me completely. They urged me not to rush into forgiving everything right away, and I agreed. I wasn't ready to forget all the stress and hurt, but I was willing to see where this new dynamic might lead. And then, just when I thought things were going smoothly, there was a slip-up. One weekend, I got home to find my mom outside my apartment. She said she just wanted to see me for a minute, holding a small bag with some baked goods she'd made. I reminded her of our agreement, but I could see the disappointment in her face. It took a lot of effort, but I kept my tone calm and told her that next time, she needed to call first. She nodded and left without making a scene, but I couldn't shake the frustration. Later that evening, my dad called. He apologized, saying they'd talked it over, and he assured me they'd stick to the plan going forward. I accepted the apology but made it clear that I was serious about keeping things as we'd agreed. I hoped this would just be a small bump in the road, not a sign of things reverting to old patterns. Since then, I've been seeing my parents occasionally, but I keep the visits short. I make sure there's always a set time for when I'll leave, so things don't get too comfortable. It's not perfect, but it feels more manageable than before. My sister and I have grown closer through all of this, which has been a surprising silver lining. She's become someone I can confide in, and she's even started to push back on some of the expectations our parents have for her, too. Now, as I sit here reflecting on everything, I realize that while things may never be exactly the way I'd hoped, I've learned how to stand up for myself. I've learned that it's okay to prioritize my own needs, even if it means upsetting people I care about. My relationship with my family might be fragile, but it's on my terms now, and that's something I never thought I'd be able to say. I shared this final update with my Reddit community, and the responses have been incredibly supportive. It feels good to know that people are rooting for me, but I'm also aware that this is just one step in a longer journey. I'm ending this story with a sense of cautious hope, knowing that I'll keep working on maintaining these boundaries, no matter what happens next. For anyone else in a similar situation, I just want to say, don't give up on protecting your peace. It's worth the struggle, even when it feels like you're going it alone.